If you are listening to and even enjoying this episode of the podcast and want to go deeper, I have a book recommendation for you. This is your host, Amanda, by the way, and the book is called The Age of Magical Overthinking, and I wrote it. I poured my heart into this book, and I really think you might like it. It's about delusion and obsession in the information age, and how the ways in which our minds naturally work are clashing with our current culture. Every chapter explores some confounding irrationality from contemporary society, including extreme cycles of celebrity worship and dethronement, mass embrace of Instagram manifestation gurus during times of crisis, and why our bodies sometimes enter literal fight or flight in response to something as objectively non-threatening as a curt email from a coworker. The book blends social science with pop culture analysis and personal stories. And if you prefer audiobooks, I recorded mine myself, so it's kind of like an extension of the podcast. Again, the book is called The Age of Magical Overthinking, Notes on Modern Irrationality, and it's available wherever books are sold. Your local indie bookstore, bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, or even that one massive online book retailer run by a cult leader. You know the one. So if you enjoy this podcast, I really hope you'll consider checking out the book. Opening up a merch shop is a podcaster dream, but I always thought it was off limits for me. But then last year, I finally opened up my very first merch store, AmandaMontell.store, using Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret is that Shopify uses Shop Pay, which boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts being abandoned and way more sales going. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout that I use. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/magical, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/magical to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/magical. Spring is in the air, but you know what's not in the air? That litter box stink. That's because at my house, we use Pretty Litter. Pretty Litter's non-clumping formula traps odor and moisture. It's lightweight, low dust, and 1 6-pound bag works for up to a month. Pretty Litter also changes color to indicate early signs of potential illnesses, like urinary tract infections, kidney issues, and more. And since Pretty Litter ships right to your door, there's never the risk of running out. So if you're unhappy with your current litter situation, definitely check it out. Pretty Litter helps keep my house smelling fresh and clean. Try and you'll love it. Go to prettylitter.com/magical to save 20% on your first order and get a free cat toy. That's prettylitter.com/magical to save 20% on your first order and get a free cat toy. prettylitter.com/magical. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details. Welcome to the Magical Overthinkers podcast, a show for thought spiralers, exploring the subjects we can't stop overthinking about, from people-pleasing to burnout. If you identify as an overthinker, a ruminator, a dreamer, or sometimes kind of feel like the natural ways in which our brains work are clashing with this particular information-overloaded time in history, then you're in the right place. This podcast is here to help dial the temperature in our minds down a little bit, to help us think less about the things that don't matter and more about the things that do. I'm your host, Amanda Montell. Today, with the help of my friend Dharna Noor, climate reporter at The Guardian, we're going to be unraveling some thought spirals about the climate crisis. And because time is ticking, dark, we're going to get right into the interview today. Darna is going to be addressing as many listener-submitted thought spirals as possible, from how to psych ourselves into mobilizing when capitalist overlords are truly responsible for the world burning, to what would happen in the near future if we truly did nothing more to stop climate change, to what's the deal with climate policy under Trump. And we'll also be sharing some actionable, realistic, everyday ideas, not only for how to make a material difference amid the climate crisis, but also how to feel better, less hopeless. Okay, onward with the interview. Darna, thank you for joining the Magical Overthinkers podcast.
Thanks for having me. What an honor.
The listeners don't know this yet, but we were buddies in high school.
Yes, we were.
Just so everyone's aware, Darna is and always was the authentically coolest person I've ever known.
Oh my God, stop.
So everyone's aware, Darna did introduce me to Bright Eyes. You did have the neatest handwriting. And now you report on the single most pressing existential threat to humanity, which is the coolest thing, in my opinion. But for those who didn't go to our high school, could you introduce yourself and your reporting?
Yeah, I'm Darna. I write about the climate crisis from a fairly particular point of view, I guess. My title at The Guardian is Fossil Fuels and Climate Reporter, which means that I mostly focus on sort of accountability reporting. I used to do a lot of science reporting about the latest findings about the climate crisis, or solutions reporting about how people are fighting back. Both of those things are very important, and I still do some of those things. But most of what I do now is here is all of the ways that politicians, fossil fuel companies, like the Exxons, the Chevrons, the lobbying firms of the world, here is all the ways that they have delayed progress or kind of halted progress on this issue. And here is what we can try to do to hold them accountable and bring the sort of lies that they've told into light, which my personal opinion is that that should be a part of all climate reporting, but it is very much not. So it's kind of a very particular niche in an already fairly niche world, although thankfully one that is getting less nichey every day. Everyone's rightfully very concerned about this existential threat that we're all facing, which is very good.
Yeah. Including and especially the listeners of this podcast who submitted the questions that will define our conversation today. But first, I have to pose to you the question that opens all of my Magical Overthinkers interviews. It goes like this. What is an irrational thought spiral that has been living rent-free in your head lately?
Oh my gosh. I feel like I have the same thought spirals constantly. Why is everyone mad at me and why does everyone hate me? That's a big one, But I feel like in a work-related way, I feel like part of the difficulty of being a journalist is constant fear of getting something very wrong. And so recently I did some reporting about a company that was very upset about some of the things that I said about them. And they chose to get in touch with me and ask me to write a big correction. And so what a good journalist in this world says is, I'm going to go back and check what I wrote. Is it all correct? Yes, if it's all good, you tell them that they should fuck off. But what I do is outwardly say, I'm not issuing a correction. And then in my brain, I'm like, oh my God, maybe I'm actually really bad at this. Maybe I got everything wrong. Maybe they're actually really good people. Oh my God, I can't believe that I would ever, maybe nobody should ever trust me again, So that's my most recent thought spiral.
That is so fucking relatable to me. You have no idea. Because, I get things wrong all the time. And I do correct them. But because so much of my writing is opinion-based, some things aren't wrong or not wrong. They're just a particular perspective or a take. And yet some people disagree in a way that makes it feel like I did get something factually wrong.
Yes, I feel you.
And the manner in which they disagree is so aggressive. Or at least it feels aggressive to me because I'm a fucking weenie. But my first thought immediately is not, oh, this is just a difference of opinion. My first thought immediately is I deserve pain.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And also part of the point of all of this is that you should be able to change your mind. But of course, instead, what I feel is I'm just too easily swayed by whatever person is talking to me sometimes, which is maybe my worst trait as a journalist. Great. Now I've introduced myself and basically told everyone why they shouldn't trust me.
No. That vulnerability is perfectly suited to the vibe of this show. Love that. So I myself just have one question to set us up, and then we will transition into the thought spirals and questions submitted by listeners. My question is the vibe among Americans like myself who care about the climate, who read about it in the news, but who aren't experts and struggle to parse through everything, especially amid my own panic. I find that groups of folks like myself are generally quite scared, have a feeling of doom. But what would you say is the vibe among climate reporters and scientists regarding the crisis? Is all hope lost? How has morale changed in recent history?
I love this question, and it's also a very difficult one to answer because there are so many different perspectives in this field. There are definitely people who are on the doomier end of the spectrum. I mentioned earlier that a lot of my work focuses on accountability, on the reasons that climate politics are in the horrible place that they are. And it's kind of in that is this idea that things don't have to be this way. And I feel like part of the reason that I chose to move in that direction is because I was finding myself moving into doominess in a way that frankly was kind of unhelpful, because feeling helpless doesn't really change anything. And in fact, I think for me at least can provoke a sort of paralysis. And inaction is exactly what people who are profiting off of climate warming industries want from you. You know, they want you to feel like nothing can ever be different, all hope is lost, and we may as well just stop trying. But for me, channeling anger is not a thing that makes me feel paralyzed. Like sadness, definitely. Despair, definitely. But anger often makes me feel more like, okay, well, that means that I'm angry because there is something else that can come out of the situation that we're in. And I feel like that's kind of where a lot of folks who spend a lot of time thinking about the climate crisis are. And like, anger doesn't always feel good, but I think sometimes it can be really useful. The other thing is like, what is climate change, right? Like, it's not one big moment where it's like, okay, we either cross this threshold and all hope is lost, or everything is like fine up till we get there. It can be really easy to misinterpret these things about like not crossing 1.5 degrees Celsius over like pre-industrial temperatures, all these really wonky things that come up really often when we're talking about the climate crisis. And those are like useful metrics insofar as you remember that like there's not some big scary horror movie moment that happens at that point. Like every tiny fraction of a degree that we can stop the world from warming actually does matter and can save countless lives. So it's not like either hope is gone, like either we can do something or we can't. It's more like we have to do whatever we possibly can, even though it's not our fault that we're in this place. It's kind of like all of our responsibility to do whatever we can to mitigate the situation. So I don't know, holding all of that at one time is like kind of difficult, but I feel like it can be better for the brain than to just be like, we're all fucked, it's all over.
Yeah, that's really helpful to just like try to separate from the binary thinking of we're completely fucked or it's gonna be okay. There's something in the middle. And do you think that living in the social media age when attention spans are getting shorter measurably, and also when like instant gratification is one of the only ways that we accept information, do you think that is affecting our patience or our ability to orient ourselves around solutions to the climate crisis?
Yeah. Honestly, I feel like my answer to is social media inhibiting our ability to understand X is always like probably yes. In this case, I don't know. I mean, I do think it's probably good that people are seeing the stories about climate progress all around them too. But I do think that there's like a tendency to oversimplify, you know, like social media, for instance, encourages you to only read the headline or look at the infographic or, you know, like go through the slides on Instagram instead of actually reading the article. And I do think that that can sometimes contribute to the like, see, all hope is lost, where it's like, no, if you look at the third paragraph of the story, the third paragraph will show you that this is like a bad threshold that we've crossed, but it doesn't mean that all hope is lost. So I think it can sort of enable this inability for people to grapple with gray areas in a way that's probably not helpful.
Yeah, because obviously, of course, those who create headlines know that a negative headline is going to be more engaging, and there might be something more positive or nuanced in the article, but social media doesn't really incentivize you to click on the article. Like, who fucking clicks on the article?
Totally.
Opening up a merch shop is obviously kind of like a podcaster dream, but I always thought it was off limits for me. I'm not very tech savvy. But then last year, I finally opened up my very first merch store, AmandaMontell.store, using Shopify. And I'm so glad I did. Nobody does selling better than Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret is that Shopify uses Shop Pay, which boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts being abandoned and way more sales going. So if you're into growing your business, selling merch, and meeting your customers wherever they're strolling or scrolling, definitely check out Shopify. It's the service that all the businesses that sell more use. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout that I use. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/magical, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/magical to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/magical. Spring is in the air, but you know what's not in the air? That litter box stink. That's because at my house, we use Pretty Litter. Pretty Litter's non-clumping formula traps odor and moisture. It's lightweight, low dust, and 1 6-pound bag works for up to a month. Pretty Litter is also great for peace of mind for those who might be concerned that their cat has a urinary issue. The litter actually changes color to indicate early signs of potential illnesses, like urinary tract infections, kidney issues, and more. And since Pretty Litter ships right to your door, there's never the risk of running out. I don't have to like run out to the store in a panic late at night because I've run out of litter. It truly is so convenient. I tend to be kind of a paranoid cat mom. And so I really appreciate the peace of mind aspect of Pretty Litter and of course the convenience aspect as well. So if you're unhappy with your current litter situation, definitely check it out. Pretty Litter helps keep my house smelling fresh and clean. Try and you'll love it. Go to prettylitter.com/magical to save 20% on your first order and get a free cat toy. That's prettylitter.com/magical to save 20% on your first order and get a free cat toy. prettylitter.com/magical. Terms and conditions apply. See site for details. So let's transition to some of our listeners' wonderful questions and thought spirals. The first one goes, as a scientist, I'm spiraling about seeing the predictions I learned about happening before our eyes. Do you relate to that?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, for all of my like channel anger and don't give in to the sadness, this is honestly the thing that makes that the most difficult for me. And I can't imagine being a climate scientist and seeing the world that we're in. Recently, there was this new science showing that the Arctic is now a net emitter, meaning that like it used to be a thing that takes planet warming pollution out of the atmosphere. And now, because the Earth has warmed enough that this is the case, basically like all of this carbon from like dead stuff, dead plants and animals that have been stored in permafrost for thousands of years is basically like streaming into the air and making the climate crisis worse. You don't have to understand the specifics of this to understand that like that is a big problem. And also I remember writing about that being a possibility of a thing that could happen 8-9 years ago. And it's really crazy making to be like, oh, that did actually happen. And, you know, we probably could have taken some steps to prevent that. Even if we didn't prevent that like particular thing from happening, it would have been great if we'd taken some real action to make things a little better by now. But also the difficult thing about, I think, like assessing where we're at with climate is that there's sort of like two yardsticks that you can measure things by, right? Like there's the yardstick of history, and then there's the yardstick of what's actually needed. And by the yardstick of history, for instance, it's like true to say that like the US in the past 4 years just invested more in mitigating climate change than it ever has before. That's true. It is also true that that is nowhere near what the yardstick of what's actually needed demands. And I think it's important to keep those two things in our heads at the same time. So that's why you can see two headlines on the same day that are like, we've avoided the worst possible case scenario for climate change. And also like scientists say we're nowhere near meeting our climate goals. So like, yes, a lot of these things that we've known would be really, really bad, were going to happen, are happening, and that's horrible. But also, we have truly avoided some of the worst case scenarios. So I don't know. That should not make you feel good, I guess, but it maybe means that all hope is not lost.
I reference this book all the time, and I want to bring it up again. The book that I want to reference is that children's book called Fortunately by Remy Charlip. And it's about this boy going throughout his day. And normally a story or a fairy tale follows like Freytag's pyramid, right? It's like a hero's journey and there's conflict and a climax and then resolution. But this book was so sort of subversive as a children's text because there's no plot like that. It's just fortunately, unfortunately, fortunately, unfortunately. One line from it is, fortunately, there was a parachute in the plane. Unfortunately, there was a hole in the parachute. Fortunately, there was a haystack on the ground. And like, that's the whole book. And I think about that all the time because I want the climate crisis, my own personal crises that are way smaller and not an existential threat to anyone but me. I want all these things to be like a hero's journey fairy tale, but instead it sounds a lot more like this book, fortunately / unfortunately.
Yes, totally. That is so deeply helpful.
Okay, the next question goes like this. How different will life look in 30 years due to the climate crisis, food, weather, travel, policies, etc.? Not like you know, you're not an oracle, but what would you say in response to this thought spirally question?
This is also such a hard question because it's like there's a number of different scenarios that could play out over the next 30 years. And if the latter changes a lot, like if policies change a lot and we, for instance, change what travel looks like in order to accommodate trying to circumvent this crisis, trying to avert the worst possible consequences of this crisis, that could mean that policy and travel change a lot, but it could mean that like food and weather change less. So for instance, one clear example of this is like there's this sort of long shot international policy proposal where basically every time you would buy a plane ticket, in the United States, because the United States is like a highly emitting country, you would have to pay an extra tax, and that tax would go to giving other countries, poorer countries, harshly impacted by the climate crisis countries, some amount of climate aid. That would really, really change what policy looks like, not just in the United States, but everywhere else. And it could change what travel looks like, because it could make travel even more expensive, which would be shitty. But it could mean that we have the ability to have access to the same foods that we have now, because we would not have to change our trade routes when some of these countries are literally underwater in 30 years and things like this. So in some cases, you can change some things in order to preserve the other things. I mean, honestly, if we don't do anything differently, like if we kind of stay on the path that we're on, policy will probably not look that much different, at least in the US. And all of this other stuff will look vastly different. We could have far less access to a lot of the food that we really like. Coffee could be harder to get, and like chocolate could be harder to get, and all of these things. The weather could be even more extreme and unpredictable. Travel could be much, much harder for that reason. So there are a lot of different possible ways that we could see the climate crisis play out over the next 30 years, but definitely there will be big changes. Also, I should say, the US is experiencing really rapid changes right now. That is nowhere near the scale of the rapidness that things are changing in other places. So like in 30 years, I think life could be a lot harder for a lot of people in the United States because of the climate crisis. Also in 30 years, the entire country of the Marshall Islands could be completely gone, swallowed by the sea. So I guess just like important to remember that we are horribly affected and also not the worst affected. So like, it's awful to say like, be grateful for it. But I guess just like, we should all have the perspective that we're in this together, but some of us are way more in it than other ones of us.
Yeah, okay. So then that brings me to the next thought spiral, which I feel like is haunting everything else, which is how do we cope while watching capitalism wreak havoc? Because we know the solutions, it sounds like. You know, scientists have notes, have suggestions, have action items, and yet we live in a big, fat fucking commercial. And in America, who's going to choose the right thing over the profitable thing? I mean, maybe that's like a cynical way of putting it, but that's how it feels.
I think that's totally right. Yeah.
So like, how do we reckon with that, knowing that these changes are so necessary and the negative impact will be so fucked for us and people who'll be way worse off than those living in the US? How do we hold that, knowing that like a lot of these changes probably won't happen because people holding the fucking marionette and the purse strings or whatever are like, oh, well, I'm going to be dead in 30 years. I'd rather die rich.
Yeah. I feel like I have two ways of answering this. And honestly, the first one is like, even though tuning out of something doesn't help, like remember to go live your life at some points and remember that there is still beauty and goodness in the world. And like, if that doesn't work every once in a while, if you start to feel too paralyzed about it, truly my answer on occasion is like, go to a rave or like take a Xanax and go to bed, which is the worst possible answer to this.
Take a Xanax and go to bed. I love that full quote. That's the takeaway.
Journalist says, answer to climate change is just do drugs and don't think about it. But seriously, sometimes I do kind of feel like there is a weird thing where I'm like, I have to remind myself that spiraling about the thing doesn't fix the thing every once in a while.
Yeah.
But also part of the reason that you have to stop the spiraling is because we're up against basically the most powerful forces in the world here. And change is going to be extremely hard and is going to mean that we have to like accept losing most of the time. And unfortunately, sometimes I feel like in the world, you just have to do things where the odds are super against you and it's really, really fucking hard. So I feel like part of the answer to like what you do when you're watching our capitalist overlords wreak havoc on ecosystems and people is take stock of that, understand it, and then also remember that like the vast majority of people are not benefiting from this, and that the only possible way that we can, I think, incite any sort of change is to help people to understand that they are not benefiting from this. That's why I think the labor movement is such a powerful sort of force here. That's why like organizing has such an important role here, is because we need to remember that like there are fewer of them. They have a lot more money, they have a lot more resources, but they don't have people on their side. Like the current way that we're treating the climate crisis is really, really bad for the majority of people. Again, worse for some people than other ones, but also really bad for most of us in some way or another. And I think important to remember that like short of completely overthrowing capitalism, there are anti-capitalist policies that could be put into place that would not only be good for the climate fight, but also be good for like people's lives. Like I would love if we lived in a world where it's like even climate deniers are on board with some climate policies, because everyone's like, yeah, I would love to not have to like pay to fill up my gas tank to go to work every day. I would love to have more public parks in my neighborhood and live in a more walkable area. Those are things that are probably less profitable, but they're really, really good for the majority of people again. And that doesn't make them less winnable. It makes them more winnable. The idea that they're like better for people at least means that there's a possibility to achieve some of these things on the local level. So I guess maybe the two answers are like sometimes chill out and then also don't get so stressed that you can't try anyway.
Yeah. Everything in moderation, as they say. Yeah, I do think that there is this like, I don't want to say poison because that feels catastrophizing, but there is this sort of like American mentality that can feel a little noxious. That growing up in this country, a lot of us feel like low-key, maybe we want to be those billionaires that we broadly claim to hate so much. And thus we don't want to hold them too accountable in the case that like we become one. Which like
Totally.
The odds of that are, I would argue, even slimmer than the odds of turning this nightmare climate ship around.
100%. Yes, 100%. Totally.
So, like, I'd rather bank on the latter. I'd rather wave the white flag on one day becoming a billionaire in exchange for, like, community-based efforts to make the world greener. But that's just me.
Listen, I totally agree. I feel like I would be really bad at being a billionaire. Like I would like to live in a world where people are not incentivized to do horrible things. I don't think there's really a way to be a billionaire that doesn't mean that you're like horribly exploiting someone. So it's like, why don't we just all share all of that wealth? And then we can all have nice things, but we can't all have the nicest things that we probably shouldn't have anyway. Probably better that way.
Okay, I'm going to need some help understanding the next question, but just because I don't get it doesn't mean I wanted to skip it. The question is, how will ecozones shift? And what does that mean for our conservation and restoration efforts? Darna, what the fuck is an ecozone?
This question is so intimidating because I feel like even though I'm sure that this is a term that I used in reporting that I did while I was writing about climate science, an ecozone is basically like a zone with a very specific climate, a very specific ecosystem, like flora and fauna that are home to that region, and I think usually nowhere else. So extremely wonky term, but I think that if you think of it like it's a unique place with a unique climate and unique like ecological features, maybe easier to conceive of.
So I'm in an ecozone in LA right now, right? Because it's like a desert that just burned down.
It's like part of an ecozone because there's like microclimate, then there's biome, which is like the whole desert. And then I think the ecozone is like the even broader one where it's like encompassed in, but I don't know where the boundaries of these things are. The listeners are smarter than me, clearly.
Same.
That's what I'm getting.
100% same. I don't even know how they know the things they know.
Yeah, you get extra credit, definitely.
So, okay, let's reframe the question in a way that we can answer, which is how will very special climate corners get fucked soon?
I mean, I think whether you're talking about like the ecozone level or the city level, a lot of things are already shifting and going to shift a whole lot more. And what that means for conservation and restoration is basically like, this is kind of an annoying answer, but it's like we need to be nimble and we need to take all of those changes into account. So we need to invest a lot in conservation, and also we need to be nimble and adapt when needed. So for instance, if we're working on forest conservation to ensure that a specific species of tree or a specific species of bird that relies on that tree in a particular place, if we're working on that and then there's a huge fire and all those trees burn down, that doesn't mean like, okay, great, give up. It's not worth it anymore. It means probably either work on preserving those trees somewhere else in a similar climate or like a climate that has become similar due to global warming. Or maybe it means take a look at forecasts and see how likely it is for fires to happen there anytime soon, and then see if there's anything that you can do to like cut down trees in a way that means that the fire would spread less, things like this. So we have to like respond to the world that we're given, unfortunately. But there's really, honestly, like very cool ways that people are dealing with these kinds of shifts. Like one big change that we've seen, for instance, is because of these shifts in the climate, so places are either getting too warm or too wet, birds are not going on their normal migration paths, which is horribly depressing to me. That just makes me feel like truly awful. But then you read about these scientists that are literally in some cases putting birds in planes and flying them along migration paths that would work for them because it gets like hardwired into these birds. And then they keep doing it. Like then every year they like fly in these paths that are going to put them closer to food that they need. Like, I don't know, the fish that they eat or whatever. So there's like really interesting ways that people are dealing with this stuff too. So it's not all bad. There's great stories out there, which is good.
I know there are, and they come up in my YouTube algorithm, which is very like climate optimistic, I have to say. I watch all kinds of mini documentaries that inspire a very temporary feeling of hope.
Very temporary feeling of hope is good sometimes.
I have a pronoun question. The word we, the like first person plural, is thrown around a lot when we're talking about climate activism. Who the fuck are we talking about? Like, are we talking about the government? Are we talking about nonprofits? Are we talking about literally me and Casey at home? Are we talking about corporations? Who are we referring to?
Yeah, I love this question and think about this all the time because I feel like in all kinds of writing, I feel like it's so easy to fall into the like, we means everyone thing. But sometimes it like really super doesn't. I didn't make climate change happen. Like we live in this world where I feel like we're all supposed to take personal responsibility for everything. And that's fine to a certain extent. But I'm also like, should I be responsible for climate change because I'm putting a plastic bag into my trash can and that plastic bag is like made of oil or gas and that's planet warming? Is it me or is it the company that sold me that plastic bag? And like in the United States, generally, in part because of like the years and years of propaganda, the decades of propaganda that we've been like sold by the oil companies, the answer to that is both, but mostly you. But I feel like I didn't tell anyone to sell me things that are bad for the rest of humanity, like for all of humanity, including myself. I didn't ask for that choice. So yeah, I think sometimes when we're talking about like we are seeing these shifts in the world, yeah, sometimes it's like really all of us are, but sometimes it's like, oh yeah, just who the fuck is we? I'm not the one who's responsible.
So like in terms of things that we can do, sometimes when those pieces of advice are distributed, I'm like, I don't think you're talking about me. Like that sounds like something that a corporation would have to do. And look, I have an LLC, but the Word Factory LLC doesn't use plastic bags. So my question is like, what can I do? Like this afternoon? What can I do tomorrow? Like we just started composting. Is that good? A listener asked, does recycling even matter when billionaires are billionairing? Like what can I do literally today and tomorrow? And does it matter?
Amanda, do you know this term prefigurative politics?
No, enlighten me.
Okay, bear with me for a second. So there's kind of, especially like sort of like soft anarchist movements in the United States, but then also like leftist movements in like South America, also radical liberal, like adbusters-y movements in, I don't know, the 90s in the US were very into this idea where it's like you do politics prefiguratively. So like you do politics to create the world that you want to see, even if it doesn't actually exist yet. And that's why you have communes where everyone shares all resources equally. Or, I don't know, in some ways like a food not bombs, where you're like, we should just do mutual aid in ways that like provide people with vegan food when they need it. That's all like prefigurative because it's like, that is not the way that the world works, but we can create a tiny microcosm of that world. And I am, one, very critical of the idea that this is the way to do politics because it's like you should take stock of what the actual world is. But two, I feel like on a tiny micro level, like in the human brain on the scale of one person, sometimes I'm like, part of the reason that we should do stuff isn't because it will change the world. It's because we can remember that it's possible to live in a world where like people can take the bus or not throw plastic in the garbage and things like this, you know? I was like vegan for a few years. And I feel like this was a large part of the reason was because I was like, okay, it's not that I am going to have some like huge effect on carbon emissions if I do this. It's more like I can remind myself that it is possible to do this in a way that is not horrible. And that doesn't mean that I think that we should be like forcing people to make choices because they're better for the planet, when in fact, ideally, we live in a world where you don't get to make choices that are bad for the planet because governments and corporations have made it so that the things that are in front of you are like fine and sustainable and good and whatever. But also, I think it can like inspire weird sort of hopefulness to be like, if my life is okay, then I guess it would be fine if everybody had to do this.
Yes. Okay. So like a sprinkle of the commune delulu be the change you wish to see in the world, while also not being so sort of dogmatic about that you fail to recognize reality for yourself or for others or for society.
Totally. Also, sometimes I feel like making those choices is hard, and then you learn about why they're hard. I did this story recently where I was like, I'm going to see if you can eat the like climate diet, which is a diet that scientists came up with that's like the best possible way to eat for climate change. I was like, I'm going to see if I can do that only from the dollar store, because lots of people get most of their groceries from the dollar store. And it was really fucking hard, and it was not pleasant. And so part of what I think that I learned from that is like, I mean, I don't think that I needed to be reminded of this. I think most people don't actually need to be reminded of this, but sometimes it's good to be reminded on like an emotional and visceral level. Oh, right. People aren't just behaving in the ways that they're behaving because they're choosing them and like out of a vast array of options. It's like you live in the world and you choose the options that are put in front of you. So I don't know. You learn why things are hard sometimes too, and that's good.
Yeah, totally. I feel like many of those listening to this podcast can appreciate how stressful it can be looking for a new therapist. First of all, it's time consuming, it's intimidating, with the added stress of finding someone who takes your insurance, not knowing who's available to meet in person or virtually. But thanks to ZocDoc, we finally have an easy, convenient, and reliable way to find the right mental health providers for us. And I'm not just talking about therapist appointments. ZocDoc is a free app and website where you can search and compare all types of in-network doctors and click to instantly book an appointment. With more than 100,000 high-quality doctors, you can find a provider across every specialty, from mental health to dental health, primary care to urgent care, and more. I'm so glad that Magical Overthinkers is sponsored by ZocDoc because I personally use it. I've used it for like 6 or 7 years, and it really takes so much of the stress out of finding and comparing doctors. I have a lot of anxiety surrounding doctor's appointments, and this really genuinely, I swear, is a huge help. Stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/magical to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That's ZocDoc.com/magical. ZocDoc.com/magical. I don't know about the rest of you magical overthinkers, but one thing I really detest is when mobile providers are less than forthright about their billing, about their pricing. I'm talking sky-high wireless bills and bogus freebies. But you know what? You can now officially say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plans, jaw-dropping monthly bills, and unexpected overages. Because Mint Mobile is here to rescue you with premium wireless plans starting at $15 a month. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can use your very own phone number with any Mint Mobile plan and bring all your contacts with you. So what are you waiting for? Ditch those overpriced wireless plans and get 3 months of premium wireless service from Mint Mobile for $15 a month. If you like your money, Mint Mobile is for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/magical. That's mintmobile.com/magical. Upfront payment of $45 for a 3-month 5 GB plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. What's the latest change other than the experiment that you embarked upon? What's something that you're doing these days that you weren't doing maybe 10 years ago that feels very au courant in terms of like environmental impact?
Honestly, it's so horrible, but I think about the kinds of changes that people make. And in the past 10 years, I'm like, I have moved in the other direction. I started eating meat again a few years ago. I like own a car now, not an EV. I own like a gas powered car now, which is a thing that I did not have 3 years ago. And unfortunately, like, especially having a car is a thing that has improved my life quite a bit, which should not be the case, right? We should be able to fucking take the bus to the grocery store. But now it only takes me an hour to go to the grocery store instead of far longer. But I feel like maybe in some ways, paradoxically, doing some of these things that are maybe like more normal and maybe not as good for the environment on a personal level has given me more buy-in to this idea that what we actually need is to press corporations to not be selling things that are bad for us. In some ways, I feel like moving away from personal choices, I mean, whatever, I still try not to fly a ton and recycle, even though I know that oftentimes the recycling is not actually getting recycled and things like this. But I feel like having a car and eating sometimes chicken makes me remember that like people are just living the lives that they are living. And like what we need is for all of us to be given better choices and not by force for us, by force on the corporations that are making those things possible in the first place, you know?
I feel bad. I didn't mean to make you feel like I was like quizzing you on how good of a person you are. I feel like actually talking about our daily habits in terms of the environment is a bit taboo, right? Because we're like, how fucking shitty is your behavior? Like, how wasteful are you? I wonder. Like, how wasteful am I? You know? And it is really good to hear that perspective because you know, it's like, why should you have to be a martyr, you know? And the other thing that your point reminded me of is that I felt like when I was younger, I was able to do the more like experimental things. Like I was vegan for a long time as well. And like only thrifting clothes for a while too. And, you know, when you get older, it's just not quite as realistic to live that experimental life all the time.
Yes.
And to your point, that should be okay. Like you deserve a car. And you're exactly right. Like, I guess just advocating and voting for people who can push for those top-down changes is so fucking important.
Yeah, totally. I feel like for a really long time, environmental politics in general have been associated with austerity, basically. Like it's very associated with what we can't have. You can't have a car, even though that helps you see your parents more quickly. You can't have beef stew, even though it's like the thing that your grandmother made you when you were sick growing up. And like, there is going to have to be some of that sort of thing. But also, I feel like it's so important to remember that like there's just so much that we can gain and there's like a lot more joy and beauty that we can find in a world that is created more sustainably. I said this earlier, but if we all live in like places where it's really nice to walk around, where you don't need a car, where you can take the bus, maybe you also, as a result of that, it's not just lowering carbon emissions, but maybe you like make friends on the bus, you know your neighbors better. You see more birds and flowers when you're walking around every day and these kinds of things, you know? And so I feel like putting the emphasis a little bit more for me on what can possibly come out of this in like a positive way can make me feel like it's a little bit more possible. I just don't think that we're going to win if we're like advocating for something where everybody has to have at least what they perceive as a worse life, you know?
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's like, I want to give up the stuff that I already have, especially when like a lot of people are already fucking struggling. I don't want to make people's lives worse.
Totally. Yeah. And there is no reason why eating less meat or whatever can't be fun. Like, what if you have fucking meatless Mondays with your besties? Like, you know, like that's maybe like a dumb suggestion, but like there are ways to make it fun. It doesn't have to be defined by lacking or deprivation.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's do a couple more questions. So this one is very concrete. Someone wants to know what is going to happen now that we aren't a part of the Paris Climate Agreement. So for some context, could you explain what that is?
Yes. The Paris Climate Agreement is a United Nations agreement that almost every country in the world signed on to in 2015, which, like many things in climate policy in general, was nowhere near sufficient to lower carbon emissions and also the best thing that we had seen up until that time to maybe at some point avert the worst possible consequences of carbon emissions. So all these countries came to the UN after many years of coming to the UN every year, talking about climate change, duking it out, talking about like who should pay the most for climate policy, who should be getting more money to like transition away from fossil fuels and things like this. They all came together and they were like, look, we're going to all agree that we at least have some goals on the books. And one of those goals is to keep the world well below, it says, 2.0 degrees Celsius of global warming, which sounds very complicated, but it's basically just like an amount of warming over like what the world looked like before climate change started, before industry was a thing, before like we were using fossil fuels. It's this increment where it's like, if things get beyond that, then there's horrible consequences that we don't even know how we're going to be able to deal with. So let's at least try to prevent us from getting to that point. And the last time that Trump was elected president, he removed the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. And then Joe Biden re-entered the United States into the climate agreement, which I think is not like a, oh my gosh, so great, whatever. It's just like complete bare minimum. But now, of course, we have a president who wants to undo even the bare minimum kinds of progress that we've seen on this front. And so once again, we have been, at least he has put the word in that we are going to come out of the Paris Climate Agreement again, which it's going to actually take a year for that to happen. But it basically means that the United States is not going to be at the negotiating table when it comes to like these big international talks where we all talk about how we're going to take on this crisis together. And I feel like even more important than that is that it means we're not going to be meeting our like financial responsibilities here. Because like the United States has been responsible for more greenhouse gas pollution, more planet warming pollution than any other country in the history of the world by far. Right now, we're not the top emitter, but when you take like all of history, we are by far the top emitter. And so that means that we have like a pretty big responsibility to help poorer countries cope with the climate crisis and also like, stop polluting, like get away from fossil fuels, bring on more like wind and solar, geothermal, whatever. The United States has a huge responsibility to do that. And now we are not going to do any of it, at least for the next 4 years. We're just not going to help countries with this at all. So that's really bad.
Wait, I have a question. Okay, I get that someone like Trump wouldn't want to engage in this bare minimum behavior for money reasons. He wants to spend money on something else. I don't fucking know. But do you think there's also a performative aspect to this? Like, do you think he pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement as a gesture, almost like as a way of pandering toward denying that the climate is a serious issue, which is like something that I guess conservatives have attached themselves to for some fucking reason? Like, it doesn't make sense, but like, do you think that he honestly did it in part as like a fuck you to Democrats and look how powerful I am and look how connected we are over our hatred of people who care about the climate to certain conservatives?
Yeah, I totally think so. It's crazy that culture war stuff, I think, is like a problematic way to even think about anything. But like, it's crazy that this would be wrapped up for him. And like, it's like the most material issue that you could possibly imagine. But it's become this like culture war thing, politicized in this very specific way. So yeah, I think it's totally like a gesturing thing. Also, it's honestly like, we know for sure that it's a gesture towards oil and gas companies who like poured tens of billions of dollars into his campaign, even though it's like, again, this thing was like very insufficient, did not do nearly enough to like actually take on those oil and gas companies. But basically by pulling out of this agreement, he's like, look, even the bare minimum stuff, you don't even have to do that. You can have anything you want. We don't care. You can have free reign. So yeah, it's like this double gesture where it's like to his donors and then also whipping up conservatives into a sort of frenzy. It's like speaking to this like base in a really horrible way.
Yeah, and I think he and his little duckies or whatever, ducklings. Why is that the image that comes to mind? It's like honestly way too adorable. His little fucklings. There we go.
We got there.
That's where I was going.
Yes,
him and his little fucklings are all so old. And I don't mean that in an ageist way. I mean like psychology studies show that we conceive of our future selves as strangers. This is why we procrastinate. This is why we like don't eat healthy. This is why we don't care about our future selves.
Like, I should write this down. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that before, and it is so edifying.
Isn't that fascinating? Like, participants in these studies demonstrated that they conceived of their not even that far in the future selves as these like absolute nobodies who they were not going to do shit for.
Yeah.
Donald Trump's like gonna die. He and his fucklings are all gonna die. They don't materially have to worry about their future selves, much less psychologically figure it out. So I wonder, like, selfishly and narcissistically, they must just be like, this is so not my problem. If we who theoretically care are still on some level like, well, it's not my problem today, you know? If even we struggle to concretize our concerns, they must just be like, fuck that. Who cares?
Yeah, 100%. It's like easy to feel that way because there's literally nothing that even the best possible US government could do to stop climate change. It's like if you are procrastinating going to the gym, you can always be like, well, I'm like not going to get buffed today. So why should I go today? Like, and then tomorrow, like, okay, well, today's not going to be the day that makes the huge difference. So I shouldn't go today. It's like so easy for countries to keep holding the door and being like, after you, you know, because it's like not something that you can kind of fix all at once. And I feel like JD Vance is going to be alive probably for a while, but I feel like even people like him can be like, well, we can't fix it all. And so why should we be the ones that don't get to like massively help our friends in the oil and gas industry? Why would it be our problem, you know?
It's like the bystander effect a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask one more big question, and then we're going to do a couple little lightning rounds for fun. Because we have to enjoy ourselves in this life sometimes.
That's right. Take a Xanax and go to bed.
Someone just wants to know how actually to hold corporations accountable for contributing to the climate crisis. Like, what can we as friends and neighbors fucking do to let them know we're not happy about the bullshit they're selling us that's bad for everyone?
It's hard because this is also the sort of thing where it's like, there's no one thing that anyone can do that fixes the whole thing. And so it makes it hard to want to do anything. How can corporations be held accountable? I mean, like, I feel like the answer for me to that really is with policy, but you need people to advocate for that policy for it to happen in the first place. Where we're at right now is basically that like corporations say that they're going to hold themselves accountable. So there's been a lot of like, look, we made a big climate pledge, and that means that you don't have to tell us what to do here. Like, we're taking care of it. We promise. We have all the solutions. We're going to be fine. Don't worry. We're already lowering our emissions. But that shit doesn't work because like they're completely non-binding. They can always roll them back. In fact, a lot of oil companies are rolling them back now just because gas is like more profitable. So they're like, okay, fuck that. Actually, we're not going to do all that climate bullshit we were talking about. We're just going to stay the course and keep drilling, like drill, baby, drill, you know? So I feel like one, the answer is like, it can't just be on corporations themselves. It has to be on governments to hold them accountable. Unfortunately, I am sort of the opinion that it can't be on people without governments either, because we don't have like, I don't know, a monopoly on violence or like the ability to like send people to jail or fine them in huge ways. But what we can do is like, a lot of people do this. You can like try to make their lives a living hell when they don't behave in ways that are particularly sustainable. So yeah, it's like twofold. It's like the more fun answer is bug the shit out of them.
By writing in like, Dear Jeff Bezos. Like, what do you mean?
You can definitely do that. There's protesters who love to storm their fancy dinners and yell at everyone in the room about how they're all evil.
Oh, okay. So it's like the Jane Fonda approach.
Yeah, you can do that. There's probably no evidence that any of those individual like storming a dinner leads to some kind of big change, but at the very least it can be like attention grabbing and remind people who the actual villains are, and that's good. And then the other more boring shit that you can do is like get your eco-socialist friends to run for office and run people on really, really popular platforms that include doing things like, I don't know, making the oil industry pay for the horrible damages that they've caused and use the money to make life better for everyone.
Some fucking PR girly has to come in here and make all that shit sexy.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I'm going to get in trouble for saying this if any of them hear me say this, which it's fine. But there's like a lot of PR companies that are working on doing that. And I don't think that anyone has figured out how to make it sexy yet. I feel like there's some that think that they have, but I don't think we've gotten there quite yet. Sorry, everyone. I mean, you're totally right that like you do have to make the boring shit sexy sometimes. But also, you live in California. If one that is listening to this lives in California, currently, there is a bill that's like a big Make Polluters Pay Act, which sounds, I think, sexier than like a lot of other ways that you can tangle this problem. It's literally like tax the shit out of the biggest companies that caused climate change and make them pay to enact climate policy in the state, which is a lot sexier, I think, than being like, put a price on carbon. And then when people are driving in the street, you need to ensure that they pay $7 extra, you know, like it's better than how we've been doing. So there's a lot of those like bills around, you know, you can advocate for those if you're interested. That's a thing that you can do like right now today.
Okay, sick. Are we advocating for that right now? We're doing it right now.
Well, listen, as a journalist, I would never advocate for anything. I'm completely objective. I don't advocate for anything. All I'm saying is that if one maybe thought that it was a good idea to take a fuckload of money from big oil, all I'm saying is that's a possibility, you know?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm a culture critic for those who are confused about my title. And I'm saying make polluters pay. Okay, let's do 2 lightning roundies. And then I'm going to ask you my final question. This is a yes or no question. Someone asks, is Elon banking on being able to move planets or something?
I think the answer is no. I think he's banking on trying to make his company look good so that he can get a lot more money from the Department of Defense. But that's just me. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay, that leads me to the second question, which is there a safe place to live? Where is the safest place with the least amount of climate-related disasters to live?
There are definitely places that are safer, but nowhere is actually safe. One place that people thought was relatively safe was Asheville, and clearly that is not the case at all. So, like, yeah, there's places with less risk, but shit is going completely crazy. I don't think there's a place that you can go where you can be like, I'm totally good here.
What about, like, Montana?
There's shit everywhere, man. In Montana, there's like horrible droughts and shit. And so farmers have like really suffered. And then there's like floods because after drought, there can be flood.
What about New Zealand?
I feel like the reason to move to New Zealand is because it rocks. Like, not because it's like totally safe, because it rocks. But again, like there are places that are more safe than other places. Like I'm not being like Montana and Bangladesh are the same. But like, I don't know. Shit is getting worse. That said, like New Zealand sounds tight. I would go.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask you one final question, and it goes like this. What do you think is the number one thing people are overthinking when it comes to the climate crisis? And what is the number one thing you think they're underthinking?
I think people are underthinking the degree to which it's not their own faults. Like, I feel like if you keep that in mind, it can help with the spirals in general. And I feel like, generally speaking, probably a good idea. That doesn't mean it's not your responsibility, but it's good to know that like it's not your fault that the world is like this. And I feel like one thing that people are really overthinking, I know that you like had some people write in about this, is whether it's okay to do normal things in your life. Like, for instance, have children, things that people have been doing for literally all of human history. I don't know. I just feel like if you're getting to a point where you're like, I should deprive myself of the things that I feel that I was put on this earth to do because climate change, I think that's probably not a super productive place to be. I think that generally speaking, you can live your life and also fight back against the horrible, like polluting capitalist overlords. I think you can do both of those things. So like, remember that it's fine to be normal and have a normal life. And also you can do that while like staying angry and advocating for change or whatever it is that you need to do.
Oh, that reminded me of one of my favorite quotes, which is something Gustave Flaubert said, which is, be regular and orderly in your life so that you may be violent and original in your work.
I think about this all the time.
Really?
Yes, 100%.
Do you feel ordinary in your life?
Sometimes I feel like I am aspiring to be ordinary. I'm like, damn, to be a normie. I don't know. I feel like there's something to the idea that like if you are too fucking weird, no one's going to listen to you, you know?
Oh my God. Yes. Yes. That really resonated with me. Okay. If folks want to keep up with you in your writing, where can they do that?
What a horrible time to be answering this question. Like, you can follow me on Twitter. It's my name, but that's a bad place to be now. You can go on theguardian.com and look at all of the articles by Dharna Noor. That's where you can find my work.
Amazing. And thank you, listeners, so much for tuning in to another episode. Now's the time where I share a tidbit of evidence-based advice for how we overthinkers can get out of our own heads this week. This one comes from a really interesting study that I came across titled Getting Out of Rumination, Comparisons of 3 Brief Interventions in a Sample of Youth. In the study, researchers found that to reduce states of rumination, or lingering unproductively on a negative thought, methods of distraction, in addition to mindfulness, were actually more effective than problem solving. I found this so interesting. So basically, to get study participants in a ruminative state, the researchers would say things like, think about why you are feeling the way you do, and think about the possible consequences of the way you feel. So me. But anything for science. Then they found that what was actually more effective at boosting mood and interrupting that rumination than the process of identifying a problem and generating possible solutions was actually just straight up distracting participants with a prompt about something totally random. Think about the shiny surface of a trumpet, or think about the layout of the local shopping center. So my takeaway from this was, if you find yourself ruminating on something, don't feel bad if someone's invitation to find a logical solution seems annoying. Instead, try maybe distracting yourself by, I don't know, thinking through the layout of your favorite mall in your hometown as a kid.
and you might just be impressed with the temporary relief it provides. That's the show. Thanks again for listening. And until the next spiral, remember, think it over. Just don't overthink it. Magical Overthinkers was created and hosted by Amanda Montell and edited by Jordan Moore of The Pod Cabin. Our theme music is by Casey Kolb. Thank you to our magical manager, Katie Epperson, coordinator, Reese Oliver, and Network Studio 71. Be sure to follow the pod on Instagram at Magical Overthinkers. We're also on YouTube, link in show notes, and ad-free episodes as well as behind-the-scenes extras are available on the Magical Overthinkers Substack at amandamontell.substack.com. I feel like many of those listening to this podcast can appreciate how stressful it can be looking for a new therapist. It's a lot. But thanks to ZocDoc, we finally have an easy, convenient, and reliable way to find the right mental health providers for us. And I'm not just talking about therapist appointments. ZocDoc is a free app and website where you can search and compare all types of in-network doctors and click to instantly book an appointment. I have a lot of anxiety surrounding doctor's appointments, and this really genuinely, I swear, is a huge help. Stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/magical to find and instantly book a top-rated doctor today. That's ZocDoc.com/magical. ZocDoc.com/magical. I don't know about the rest of you magical overthinkers, but one thing I really detest is when mobile providers are less than forthright about their pricing. But you know what? You can now officially say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plans, jaw-dropping monthly bills, and unexpected overages. Because Mint Mobile is here to rescue you with premium wireless plans starting at $15 a month. So what are you waiting for? If you like your money, Mint Mobile is for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/magical. That's mintmobile.com/magical. Upfront payment of $45 for a 3-month 5GB plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details.